Hello there! Welcome back to the Pacific War channel, the channel where we cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War, 1937 to 1945, and all the major events that led up to it. Now this is going to be part 2 of the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. If not already done so, you should probably go watch the first part, but if not, you know what? You do you. Now also, if you've not already hit that like and subscribe button, please do so, as I've got my two parrot friends over here and they need some peanuts, which only your subscriptions can get them. So let's do a quick breakdown of both nations' military forces that will be fighting in this war. First, we have the Imperial Chinese Army and the Beiyang Fleet. Please note that Western observers at the beginning of this war unanimously thought China would crush Japan. The Qing dynasty did not have a unified army and was still using a system almost identical to the one that was used during the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion. There was the Eight Banner Army, the Green Standard Army, the Braves, the Huai Army, under the personal authority of Li Hongzhang, which was considered China's best. The Huai Army, although the minority, would be taking the majority of fighting in this war. A big issue was that each army had a large number of imported firearms, but nothing was standardized. Thus, they were equipped with heterogeneous firearms, which ranged from very old-fashioned to modern rifles. This caused an enormous issue with differing sorts of ammunition supplies. Combine this with the corruption within the Qing administration, many were embezzling arms and munitions. A lot of ammunition would go missing or be made defectively. The army was a mixture of fully modernized, partly modernized, and extremely old-fashioned, almost medieval units, which no commander could hope to utilize successfully. Many of the older officers thought that the war could be fought the same way the Taiping Rebellion was fought. The soldiers themselves came from such differing parts of China that they had no sense of unity nor affinity for another. They suffered from a lack of morale because on top of all of this, they had not been paid in a very long time, and many were suffering from opium addiction. The Beiyang Fleet was one of 4 modernized Chinese navies and the dominant navy in East Asia. The Japanese were apprehensive about facing it, especially the 2 German-built battleships Jingyuan and Junyuan. Yet China's warships were actually overaged and obsolete despite appearances. They had more armor, but were also greater in weight, making them slower, and their crews were not properly disciplined in their maintenance. A major problem was that their main armaments, most had short-barrel guns in twin barbettes mounted in echelons and could only fire in restricted arcs. This meant low muzzle velocity, poor penetration, and terrible accuracy at longer ranges. The Chinese naval tactics were also very crude. Ships were assigned in pairs, and doctrine was to stick close together following the flagship and to fight head-on in a beam formation. The signal books that they used were all in English, a language most Beiyang naval officers did not fully understand. The Imperial Japanese Army was first modeled on the French Army, but after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, began to adopt a more Prussian military model. The IGA were equipped with an 8mm single-shot Murata Type 18 breech-loading rifle as standard issue. Magazine Type 22s were being used and introduced in the use of the Imperial Guard and 4th Division. Their artillery was a 75mm field gun based off Krupp designs. Many IGA officers studied in Europe, and they were well educated in the most up-to-date strategies and tactics. They were roughly a force of 120,000 within 2 armies and 5 divisions. The Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet was mostly modeled on the British Royal Navy with some influence from France. They planned to employ the Je ne gueule doctrine, a strategic naval concept developed by France. It advocated for the use of small, heavily armed ships to combat larger ones such as battleships. The French devised a strategy to counter Great Britain's larger navy. The Japanese would utilize fast warships, specifically cruisers and torpedo boats outfitted with the capability to destroy larger ships. So the last time at the Battle of Pungdo resulted in the sinking of the Kaohsiung and a major victory for the Imperial Japanese Navy, but official war was not declared yet. 4 days after the Battle of Pungdo, 4,000 Japanese troops led by Major General Oshima Yoshimasa marched south of Seoul to attack the Chinese garrison at Seonghwan Station. The Chinese garrison was 3,880 men strong under the command of General Zhu Zhiqiao. They knew that the IJA were coming, and they built fortifications such as trenches, 6 redoubts, and flooded the local rice fields. A major problem for Zhu Zhiqiao was that his anticipated reinforcements were lost at the Battle of Pengdu, and they had been preparing for a pincer move against Seoul. The IJA began with a night attack on July the 28th, hitting the front of the Chinese defenses with a diversionary force, while the main force of infantry, cavalry, and artillery successfully outflanked them by crossing the Yangtze River. They fought bitterly for 2 hours, forcing the Chinese to flee to Asan, leaving behind many of their weapons and equipment. The IJA in quick pursuit took Asan by 1500 hours on July 29, 1894. Surviving Chinese forces fled towards Pyongyang, and the Chinese casualties were around 500 killed and wounded versus 88 killed and wounded for the IJA. The chance of encircling Seoul was now lost for the Chinese. Official declaration of war was issued by Emperor Guangxu on July the 31st and Emperor Meiji on August the 1st. What is interesting about the declarations was the major difference in tones. Emperor Meiji's declaration used phrases like the family of nations and law of nations. He was portraying Japan to be a modern state, perhaps even a world power, and that they were acting to help Korea break free of China's archaic vassalhood to be an independent state. Emperor Guangxu, on the other hand, made multiple references to China's traditional tributary system with Korea and that they were merely protecting their vassal. They accused the Japanese of breaking treaties and attacking them unjustly. Most importantly, they refer to the Japanese only using the racial slur "Wuozhen," loosely meaning dwarf, countless times and speak in a general tone of superiority. Chinese forces in Korea retreated to the city of Pyongyang, where they consolidated into a force of 13 to a possible 15,000 and began to build defenses. The Japanese had 8,000 forces under General Oshima around Seoul and Chumulpo, 10,000 troops of the 1st IJ reinforcements under the command of Marshal Yamagata Aritonomo, consisting of the 5th and 3rd Provincial Divisions, landed at Chumulpo on June the 12th, 1894. They all rendezvoused, combined as a force of over 20,000 strong to attack Pyongyang. The defenses at Pyongyang were too strong, so the Japanese focused on capturing Mukdangtae, a Chinese fortress north of Pyongyang. Mukdangtae was at a higher elevation than Pyongyang, allowing the Japanese to set up artillery and bombard Pyongyang brutally. On September the 15th, while bombarding the city, the Japanese also assaulted the city from multiple directions, forcing the Chinese to surrender. 2,000 Chinese died, around 4,000 were wounded, while the Japanese lost 103 with 433 wounded. The Chinese lost the Qing Hui Muslim general Zuo Baogui from Shandong province to artillery fire. By the early morning of September the 16th, the Japanese occupied the city. Taking advantage of the heavy rainfall, many Chinese managed to escape to the coastal city of Yuiji. In early September, before the news of the loss of the Battle of Pyongyang, Li Hongzhang decided to reinforce Pyongyang by employing the Beiyang Fleet with transports to the mouth of the Daedong River. Over 6,500 troops were being sent, but the IJN knew the Chinese would send reinforcements, so they sent their combined fleet to patrol the Korean coast to force a decisive naval battle. The IJN needed to control the Yalu Sea, to be able to freely send their troops to Korea and to stop China from doing the same. On September the 17th, the IJA 5th Division was tasked to land at Chumulpo to push the retreating Chinese forces towards the Yalu River. The IJN thought they could bait the Beiyang Fleet to move there where they could force a decisive naval battle. They found the Beiyang Fleet at the mouth of the Yalu River. The Chinese were able to land 4,500 troops before being caught up in a naval battle. The Beiyang Fleet was commanded by Ding Ruchang and consisted of these ships. They anchored in shallow waters around the mouth of the Yalu River, and then they saw the smoke of the IJN. The combined fleet of the IJN consisted of 2 squadrons. The Flying Squadron, commanded by Tsusbo Kozo, consisting of these ships, and the Main Squadron, commanded by Admiral Ito Sukeyuki, consisting of these ships. Both fleets began to intercept another, but the Beiyang Fleet was slower with an average speed of 15 knots, whereas the IJN ships could move up to 20 knots. The Beiyang Fleet tried to form a line with ships side by side, but due to confusion in signals and slow speed, they ended up in a wedge position with the 2 battleships at the forefront. The IJN came at them in a column formation with the Flying Squadron in the front and the Main Squadron following from behind. The Chinese began to open fire at 5,000 meters, which was too far to cause significant damage. The Japanese held their fire for over 20 minutes, heading diagonally across the Beiyang Fleet, going twice its speed. On the signal of Admiral Ito, the 2 squadrons divided, with the Flying Squadron under Tsusboi heading 8 to 14 knots at the center of the Chinese formation before heading right to flank them. Once in effective range, they battered the Choyang and Yangwei and moved northward. The Main Squadron followed the same course, but turned left and made a complete turnaround to circle the Chinese. As the Flying Squadron made their way back south, the 2 squadrons caught the Chinese in between and began to bombard them. The Jingyuan and Junyuan took the heaviest hits. It did little to their heavy armor, but the Japanese quick firing decimated the crews on their decks. The Flying Squadron re-engaged and sunk the cruiser Jiyuan, which had run out of ammunition and was attempting to ram a Japanese cruiser. This set off many Chinese ships to flee north. The Flying Squadron hunted down and destroyed the Jingyuan, but this allowed the other Chinese vessels to flee. The Main Squadron under Admiral Ito then circled the remaining Chinese vessels and began firing their heavy and quick-firing guns, sweeping the decks and the superstructures of the Chinese vessels. The return fire from the Chinese damaged Yoshino, Akagi, Saikyo-maru, Matsushima, and Hiei. The Matsushima was the most severely damaged because it lacked armor and was struck by 12-inch shells that tore open its deck and ignited ammunition, causing 100 casualties, forcing Admiral Ito to transfer his flag to Hashidate. By sunset, the Jingyuan and Junyuan were nearly out of ammunition but not significantly damaged, with the rest of the surviving Beiyang Fleet retreating to Lushunko, called Port Arthur by Westerners, for repairs. 5 Beiyang Fleet vessels were sunk, with 1,350 sailors killed. The IJN had 6 ships damaged, with 380 sailors killed. The Beiyang Fleet received orders from Li Hongzhang to withdraw to Weihaiwei, fearing that they could be trapped in Port Arthur. The flagship of the Beiyang Fleet, Jingyuan, struck rocks at the entrance of Weihaiwei harbor, beaching it, and the only docks capable of making repairs to it were in Port Arthur, thus effectively taking it out for the remainder of the war. The captain Lin Taizheng committed suicide in shame. The reputation of the Beiyang Fleet was severely damaged by this loss, and the IJN won command of the Yellow Sea, enabling the Japanese to move troops to Korea at will. On September the 25th, a week after the naval defeat at the Battle of Yalu, the Guangxu Emperor announced that because of the suffering of the Chinese soldiers and civilians, the Empress Dowager would not hold her 60th birthday party. General Yu Zhichao was sentenced to death for his failures to command the ground forces in Korea, but he was able to avoid execution by using connections he had in the Qing government. He reportedly fell into opium addiction. He was replaced by Song Qing, a veteran commander of the Taiping, Nyan, and Dungan rebellions. With the defeat of Pyongyang, the Chinese abandoned northern Korea and took up defensive positions in fortifications alongside the Yalu River near Juliancheng. Japanese reinforcements arrived in Korea on October the 10th, allowing them to proceed north. On the night of October the 24th, 1894, the IGA snuck across the Yalu River using pontoon bridges they made. On October the 25th, at 5 p.m., they surprise attacked the outpost of Hushan, east of Juliancheng. The defenders deserted their positions, and by the next day, a full retreat of Juliancheng was made. The Chinese lost over 2,000 men, while the Japanese reportedly lost only 4. General Yamagata's First Army took the city of Daodong, while the Chinese forces there retreated. With the capture of Juliancheng, the Japanese established a firm foothold in Chinese territory. The Japanese now had 2 major targets, Dalian and Port Arthur. The 1st IGA split into 2 groups under General Nozu Michitsura, with the 5th Provisional Division marching to Mukden, and Lieutenant General Katsuro Taro's with the 3rd Provincial Division pursuing fleeing Chinese forces towards the Liaodong Peninsula. When Lieutenant General Katsuro Taro's forces reached Liaodong Peninsula, it was winter and the heavy snow made the IGA easy targets, enabling the Chinese to push them back somewhat. Despite the brutal resistance, the IGA took Daduka, Dakushan, Ziyuan, Tumuchang, Haicheng, and Kangwaze by December the 3rd. The 2nd IGA Corps, under Ayama Iowa, landed on the south coast of Liaodong Peninsula, making an amphibious assault in late October, quickly capturing Jinzhou and Dalian by early November. All of this left Port Arthur open. Now, before the Battle of Port Arthur, foreign correspondents covering the war had reported favorably on the battlefield conduct of Japanese soldiers, yet the savage combat the Japanese faced during the winter just before the Port Arthur campaign would send them into a vengeful mood. The IGA approached Port Arthur, where there were skirmishes on the outskirts, and a panic set in on the defenders of the city, resulting in looting and destruction of property. Many Qing officers secretly fled the fortified city on small boats. On November the 18th, the IGA found that wounded forces they were forced to abandon en route to Port Arthur had been severely mutilated, with their hands and feet cut off, some burnt alive. You see, the Chinese had placed bounties on POWs, up to 50 taels of silver for their heads and other body parts during the war. The Chinese allegedly mutilated several IGA bodies and displayed them at the entrance of the city, infuriating the Japanese. On November the 21st, the IGA stormed the fortifications under heavy fire, and during the night of the 22nd, the surviving Chinese defenders deserted the remaining positions, abandoning 57 large caliber and 163 caliber artillery pieces. Over 4,000 Chinese forces were killed, 600 captured, and the Japanese reportedly lost 40, with 241 wounded. As the IGA entered the city, they were fired upon from houses where Chinese forces had hidden themselves and allegedly were wearing civilian clothing to blend in with the local population. The Japanese commanders ordered their men to go house to house to find the remaining Qing soldiers. What followed was the infamous Port Arthur massacre, and please note, scholars debate this event to this very day. The IGA entered the city around 2 p.m., just after seeing the mutilation of their comrades. They proceeded to massacre the inhabitants of the city. Western observers reported rape, murder, and mutilation. Sources vary greatly, but it is believed that up to 60,000 people were killed. Chinese and Western newspapers carried stories of IGA engaging in drinking, sex orgies, and atrocities on the local populace. All of this would be a preview of what would take place in Nanjing 4 decades later. Because of the condemnation of the event, the IGA ordered an investigation by Commanding General Oyama Iowa, the same man who supported the establishment of the Japanese Red Cross Society. His findings showed reasonable cause for the actions of the IGA, stating that the Qing military was hiding amongst the civilians wearing civilian clothing and retaliating. Yet his own legal advisor, Ariga Naigo, who had witnessed the events firsthand, concluded that under international law, Japan bore ultimate responsibility for their actions. What news of the event that reached the Japanese public was only about Japan's great successes, which were celebrated in huge parades in Tokyo. This event stained Japan's military reputation internationally. Having captured Port Arthur, the next target would be the major port, the Beiyang Fleet, Weihaiwei, at the tip of the Shandong Peninsula. The defenses of Weihaiwei were a series of land fortifications overlooking the harbor, equipped with Krupp and Armstrong field cannons, including 2 fortified islands in the bay. The IGA separated into 2 columns, one following the coastal road, the other along a path 4 miles inland, both to converge on Weihaiwei on the 29th of January, the Chinese New Year. The IGA launched a 3-pronged attack on the landward fortifications to the south and east of the town. The attack was hampered by severe blizzard conditions, and the Beiyang Fleet bombarded them, killing Major General Odira Yasumuse, the highest-ranking IGA casualty of the war. The Chinese army made a stand for over 9 hours before retreating, leaving the fortifications largely intact. IGA forces entered the town of Weihai on February the 2nd without opposition, as the last garrison had fled the night before. With the land fortification guns in the hands of the IGA, they were now in a position to fire upon the trapped Beiyang Fleet, making Admiral Ding Ruchang's situation dire. The Japanese managed to remove the boom protecting the harbor, allowing their torpedo boats to make repeated night attacks on the Beiyang Fleet. Combined IGN Fleet attacked on February the 7th, severely damaging the Dingyuan and sunk 3 vessels. The crews of the rest of the fleet mutinied and attempted to escape to Yentei, but in total 6 were destroyed. 7 remaining vessels were captured by the Japanese. During the battle, the Chinese defeat looked certain, and Admiral Ito Sukeyuki made an appeal to Admiral Ding, who was a personal friend of his. In his letter, he expressed regret that they had to be at war with another, and he appealed to him to prevent further unnecessary loss of life by capitulating. Ito advised Ding to take political asylum in Japan until the end of the war, and then after he could return home. Ding thanked his friend for the message, but stated that he could not forsake his duties as Admiral of the Beiyang Fleet, and that the only remaining thing that he could do was die. Ding Ruchang committed suicide by overdosing on opium in his office at Yugong Island HQ. His deputy admiral, Li Hongzhang, was ordered to scuttle and blow up the Dingyuan. After doing so, he also committed suicide. Admiral Ding Ruchang was a respected officer who was a cavalry officer who helped suppress the Taiping and Nanyang rebellions, and who also had led the Beiyang Fleet since 1886. The Japanese knew the admiral's reputation and admired him for taking responsibility in a manner of a proper defeated samurai. The Japanese allowed his body to be carried away on a Chinese ship, and as it passed by, the Japanese lowered their flags in an expression of respect. The Battle of Weihaiwei saw the Chinese casualties up to 4,000, with an unknown amount of losses for the Japanese. The remaining vessels of the Beiyang Fleet were surrendered, and the fleet was no more. Although the war continued with more battles such as the Battle of Yingkou and the invasion of the Pescador Islands, the capture of Weihaiwei effectively ended the war, and peace negotiations were quickly brought forward. In January 1895, the Japanese forces were capable of attacking Beijing from Weihaiwei, and this gave the Japanese victors the power to impose a treaty strongly in their favor. In Japan, there was a triumphant mood, a sense that Japan had arrived as a world power, and now could humiliate a nation that historically had humiliated it. Japan chose as a model the conditions that Prussia imposed on France in the Treaty of Frankfurt following its victory in 1871. The treaty included the grants of territory and imposed heavy costs on France. The scholar, Sarah Payne, concluded that Japan's remarkable military successes, winning every important battle without losing a single ship, was not the result of superior ships or weapons. The Chinese had purchased a number of excellent warships and a large supply of rifles. However, many of these ships were old and obsolete, and many Qing officials had been chosen because of their imperial examination credentials rather than their own military skill. The ammunition required for the countless different types of firearms, because there was no standard issue firearm, made the lack of supplying the units a catastrophe. Added to this was a rampant embezzling of ammunitions by corrupt officials, some ships finding out that half of their shells were either not present or defective while in the midst of battle. Having soldiers from so many different regions of China, each with different dialects and loyalties, rendered coordination impossible in comparison to the Japanese, who had standardized equipment, superior training, better intelligence, and a sense of unity and patriotism. China was simply unable to compete with it at this time. Overall, there was a high level of corruption and incompetence within the Qing administration. The institutional weaknesses seeped into its military high command and made the Beiyang Fleet ineffective. The Qing dynasty had prepared its military more so to quell rebellions rather than fight another nation, and its ineffective and outdated military system could not meet the challenge. It was time to surrender. The Chinese had previous attempts at negotiations. They sent 2 officials on February the 1st to Hiroshima to speak with Prime Minister Ito. They were, however, mid-level officials who did not have the authority to make decisions and affix seals. In Japanese eyes, this showed the arrogance of China, who was still not treating Japan with proper respect, and they were unwilling to make any concessions. Prime Minister Ito told them that Emperor Meiji was prepared to carry on negotiations, but only with an official who held power to conclude agreements and affix seals. So the two officials came back empty-handed. 6 weeks after the Japanese destroyed the Beiyang Fleet and captured Weihaiwei, they were poised to attack Beijing. The Chinese, in haste, sent an envoy who had the power to affix seals to an agreement. The Japanese would only accept as negotiators Prince Gong or Li Hongzhang, both of whom could affix seals. The top officials in Beijing, all Manchu, worried that if the Manchu Prince Gong were to sign an unpopular treaty, it would strengthen anti-Manchu sentiments already present in China. They thought it better to send a Han Chinese representative like Li Hongzhang to make an unpleasant concession, and then blame him for it later on. The Japanese demands were harsh. The IJA were concerned with the Russian presence in Northeast Asia from its newly built Trans-Siberian Railway, so they demanded control over the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur and Dalian, which would deny Russia a warm water port in Northeast Asia. The IJN wanted control over Taiwan and to strengthen its position in the Western Pacific. The Japanese financial leaders sought large indemnities to finance the costs of heavy industrialization. The Japanese were confident they could impose all of these demands, even though they knew Western powers would not accept Japan's control over such large amounts of territory on the Chinese mainland. On March 19th, Li Hongzhang and 100 officials arrived in Shimonoseki, a port at southwest corner of Honshu. Shimonosuke was in Yamaguchi Prefecture, the old Choshu domain, where Ito Hirobumi grew up. Although Li Hongzhang and Ito Hirobumi, who had worked together and negotiated in the past and arguably had a friendship and spoke English to another, they used a Chinese-English interpreter for this occasion. Ito Hirobumi began with a proposal that China would certainly refuse. Japan would occupy Tianjin and Seonghwan, China's major railways, and Chinese funds would support all of this Japanese occupation. Li Hongzhang could not accept any of this, and Ito knew this very well as both men were quite close to each other and understood each other's political positions at home. On March the 24th, when Li Hongzhang was returning to his lodging from the negotiation location, a young Japanese firebrand attempted to assassinate him. Before the police could stop the man, Li Hongzhang was shot in the cheek just below his eye. Though it was incredibly painful, Li Hongzhang chose not to remove the bullet. Japanese officials and the Japanese press were thoroughly embarrassed and aware of the immense damage this would cause to Japan's international reputation. Apologies came in all over Japan and abroad. The Japanese government sought to atone for what it considered a hideous act. Emperor Meiji issued an official apology to the Chinese nation and offered his personal physician to treat Li Hongzhang. The emperor also offered China a 3-week armistice. Li Hongzhang used his blood nephew, Lord Li Jingfang, to continue negotiations with Ito. Following the assassination attempt, the Japanese lessened their demands but still remained quite harsh. After 6 days, a treaty was formed. The Treaty of Shimonoseki handed the Pescador Islands, Taiwan, and parts of Liaodong Peninsula, Dalian, to Japan. China was to recognize the complete independence of Korea and to end its suzerainty. China was to pay a war indemnity of over 200 million cuping taels, roughly 3/4 of China's annual budget, over the course of 4.5 years. China was to open ports to Japan, Shaanxi, Chongqing, Suzhou, Hangzhou, and to grant Japan favored nation status for foreign trade, which meant that they would not have to pay the Yijin transit tax. Li Hongzhang was denounced for accepting the conditions of the treaty in China. Thousands of Chinese officials wrote memorials to the emperor denouncing the treaty, but the emperor knew that if China did not sign it, Beijing and Shenyang would be devastated and the Ming tombs could be destroyed. The Manchu court did everything it could to shift the blame. Emperor Shishi passed responsibility to the Guangxu Emperor, whom, by selecting Li Hongzhang as negotiator, passed blame onto the Han Chinese for agreeing to such terms. Ironically, Li Hongzhang, a man who spent his entire life trying to strengthen China for decades and was never fully supported by conservative officials, took the blame. He was stripped of all of his titles except that of Grand Secretary. He was used as a scapegoat for agreeing to the Treaty of Shimonoseki for generations. The Japanese had always been historically treated as inferiors to China, and only when Beijing was in danger did the Chinese yield the tone of superiority. The Japanese took this opportunity to return the humiliation. One territory that they had demanded was the area around Shenyang, which was not a significant location strategically, but it was the original Manchu capital, and it held the imperial tombs. Thus, the Manchu rulers of China for 3 centuries were thoroughly humiliated, and anti-Manchu sentiment would grow even more widespread in China as a result, aiding the destruction of the Qing dynasty 16 years later. In their personal meetings, Ito Hirobumi reminded Li Hongzhang that when they had met in 1886, Li had threatened Ito if he did not agree to China's proposals to quiet things down in Korea. At the time, Li could have never imagined that one day Japan would be the victor of a war over China. Ito said that he had told Li that China should take the time to modernize. Li admitted that he tried to pursue modernization, but many officials resisted and they won out. Li asked Ito if their positions had been switched, what Ito would have done differently. Ito said that he could not have done as well as Li had. Although Li Hongzhang was impressed by Japan's achievements, he was so upset by the war and the treaty that he vowed to never set foot on Japanese soil again. The next year, a ship he was on traveled and docked at Yokohama, but he refused to go ashore. 6 days after the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the ministers of Russia, Germany, and France stationed in Japan called on the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to offer friendly advice. This triple intervention suggested that the Liaodong Peninsula area that was handed over to Japan in the treaty should be given back to China. They pointed out that if Japan occupied that area, not too far from Beijing, it would cause the Chinese to worry and be considered a threat to Korea and an obstacle of peace in East Asia. It was clear if Japan did not follow this friendly advice, the foreign powers were prepared to use force to intervene, and Japan could not hope to match their combined power at this time. On November 7, 1895, 6 months after the Treaty of Shimonoseki, a new treaty was signed returning the Liaodong area back to China. The Japanese government knew its public would find this to be outrageous, so they made a story that they were handing it over as a magnanimous gesture to China. The Japanese public exploded nonetheless, arguing that Japan had won a war and ended the unequal treaties, and should not bow down to the demands of Western powers anymore. The Japanese press stated Japan was not yet fully welcomed as a world power. Russia took over the Liaodong Peninsula shortly after and began to use Port Arthur as a warm water port 3 years after. The dice of war would be cast again. So, just to summarize everything that we've learned, corruption within the Qing administration led to low performance for the Beiyang Fleet and for the Qing military overall. While on the other hand, modernization efforts made by Japan helped their combined fleet and their military win a war against a larger nation like China. In the end, the treaty that Japan and China signed humiliated the nation of China and bolstered Japan to become the dominant power in Asia. However, the looming threat of the Russian Empire was near. Come back next time where we're going to cover the Boxer Rebellion. And please, if you've not already done so, hit that like and subscribe button so that I can feed my little parrot friends over here. This has been the Pacific War Channel, over and out.